There is an old speakeasy in Greenwich Village where generations of great American writers once spent their days and nights. The legend is that Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda drank away a big part of their honeymoon at this corner table. This is where Faulkner sometimes boozed for the afternoons, and Hemingway argued and fumed at the bar. E.E. Cummings sketched his self-portrait in lower case. After the First World War, during Prohibition and into the 20s and 30s, they all sat here, laughed, and lied here. And she is here, looking down, bemused by it all. The literary tigress of the Jazz Age, taking her rightful place among the other legends in Chumley's bar. Thomas Hardy said that the America of the 1920s made two major contributions to the world. One was skyscrapers, the other was the poetry of Edna St. Vincent Millay. The first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for poetry, in the 1920s and 30s, she was as popular a poet as America has ever produced. She was on the cover of magazines, did national radio broadcasts, wrote plays and opera. In the middle of the Depression, she sold 50,000 copies of a book of poems in a matter of weeks, and was acclaimed as one of America's 10 most famous women. Yet within a decade or two after her death, her poems were mostly ignored. The details of her scandalous life, mostly forgotten.
It is astonishing, isn't it? By 1976, when the new edition of the Oxford Book of American Poetry came out, not a single Millay poem was included. And this is a mere 25 years after her death, a mere 40 years from the height of her celebrity.
But there was a time when every thinking woman in America wanted to be just as independent and brave and sexy as Edna St. Vincent Millay. And they all knew the four lines that cemented her fame and became the anthem of her age.
My candle burns at both ends. It will not last the night. But ah, my foes, and oh, my friends, it gives a lovely light.
In the hamlet of Austerlitz in upstate New York, Edna St. Vincent Millay's farmhouse still stands. It is one of the most remarkable landmarks in American letters. For since she died here in 1950, very little has been altered, very little moved. It remains inside a literary tomb, a ghostly mausoleum. The gowns and dresses she wore on her packed speaking tours are still on their hangers. Her riding boots stand waiting. Her tiny shoes still sit prepped on their shelves. Her underclothes and gloves are still in the drawers, preserved in satin pouches. The bathroom scale remains untouched. The kitchen, modernized in 1948, is no longer modern. In her library, the books are still neatly on their shelves in sections, here for poetry, there for reference. And downstairs, in her sprawling living room, her two Steinways still stand, just the way she left them. Even the preserves and the homemade wine in the basement have sat untouched for over 60 years. Domestic keepsakes of a woman whose life and poetry once scandalized America.
And that poem, I, being born a woman and distressed by all the needs and notions of my kind,
am urged by your propinquity to find your person fair, and feel a certain zest to bear your weight upon my breast. So subtly is the fume of life designed to clarify the pulse and cloud the mind and leave me once again undone, possessed. Think not for this, however, the poor treason of my stout blood against my staggering brain. I shall remember you with love, or season my scorn with pity. Let me make it plain. I find this frenzy insufficient reason for conversation when we meet again.
And at the end she says, I find this frenzy insufficient reason for conversation when we meet again. Meaning that she wants to make love to this guy, but not talk to him. I think that was shocking to people, yeah. Probably not shocking to people in Greenwich Village where she was living, but shocking to people across the country.
She did what all good writers do. She behaved badly. That is to say, she hurt people whom she needed to hurt. She abandoned people or used people whom she shouldn't have in order to make poems that last longer than the bitter feelings she roused. It's not fair, but to write a great poem is not easy. And who would not forgive, in the long run, someone who behaves badly?
The shock value of those early sonnets is long gone. Edna St. Vincent Millay has become a faded phantom of America's literary past. But there are still a few who cherish her poems and work to preserve her memory.
So this is really very special and a special treat. I just want to check with you chaps first. Do you faint easily? No? Very good. Because I've had some very brawny males have to sit down in the bed after they see this, because this is a wig of Millay's hair. It was made by Cora for her beautiful china doll.
The doll's wig, crafted from Edna's flame-red hair, is now over 100 years old. It was made by her mother, Cora, for the daughter with the unusual middle name.
Her mother, Cora Millay, had a sort of crazy brother. And this brother shipped out on the El Monte. And he shipped out at the exact period when Cora was pregnant for the little baby who became Edna St. Vincent Millay. And when he was down in New Orleans loading the ship, he got a little, shall we say, transfixed by drink. And he fell asleep in the hold of the ship.
And by the time he got to New York City, he was almost dead. And they brought this wraith out and rushed him to St. Vincent's Hospital, where they looked after him and saved his life.
And since it was St. Vincent's Hospital that had brought him back to life, she thought she'd name her child St. Vincent. And she did. Edna St. Vincent Millay.
Edna St. Vincent Millay.
So in February of 1892, Edna St. Vincent, named after a hospital, became the first of the three daughters of Cora and Henry Millay. They settled in the small town of Camden on the coast of Maine, but the marriage was not a happy one. They were divorced in 1901. Edna was 9 years old.
There was no evidence that he abused her, physically abused her. There was no real evidence that he drank too much. He played a mean hand of cards. He fished, but I think he wasn't a go-getter in any sense of the word. Handsome, sort of broad-faced, blue eyes, blonde hair, and not much else, maybe.
Henry's alimony payments were irregular, and the sisters, Edna, Norma, and Kathleen, would remain distant from their father. They grew up desperately poor in a series of rented houses in the less desirable parts of Camden. Cora had been on the stage as a young woman, touring in vaudeville, but she now supported herself and her three daughters by making wigs and hairpieces and by hiring herself out as a country nursemaid in the surrounding towns and villages.
Cora Millay was strong-willed, very interested in self-education, almost that sort of Emersonian sense, a person who had not finished high school, but had a collection of books to rival certainly any of the libraries in Rockland, Maine, or where Edna was born, or Camden, Maine, or Union, Maine. Forget it. And she collected books and she read them. And it was like her life. It was like an invention of herself. So she was strong-willed, well-educated, certainly for the period, but not a college person, not even a high school person. There was a period where they didn't have enough money. They weren't eating terribly well, okay? This was in an era before the notion of vitamin C and orange juice. And we're talking about northern Maine or mid-coast Maine. But she said there was always money for the extravagances, whether it was music and opera or piano lessons or at one point the study of French. You know, it was just a remarkable family in a way that is both remarkable and scary, I think, a little.
Sometimes the rain would come down and flood the kitchen, and then it would snow and it would get cold, and the floor would freeze. And rather than cry and whine, they put on their skates and skated around the kitchen.
At high school in Camden, it was generally agreed that Edna Millay was the smartest student. She edited the school paper, was a talented pianist. She spoke French. But when school was over, there was no money for college. At 18, she got the occasional job as an actress, appearing at the local opera house. But it didn't pay the bills. She started taking in typing and continued looking after her sisters, while her mother took those out-of-town jobs.
In her diaries, at times I just had to stop reading them because she just got so bloody tired of washing, of cooking, of doing stuff to Norma's hair, and of darning and all this, and when she really wanted to write poetry.
By 19, she felt she was already aging.
I'm getting old and ugly. My hands are stiff and rough and stained and blistered. I can feel my face dragging down. I can feel the lines coming underneath my skin. They don't show yet, but I can feel 100 of them underneath. I love beauty more than anything else in the world, and I can't take time to be pretty. Crawl into bed at night, too tired to brush my hair. My beautiful hair.
Very few poets are prodigies. There are brilliant young musicians or mathematicians, but poetry really requires a lot of experience. It requires not just a kind of technical virtuosity, but it requires scars on the heart.
In the summer of 1911, with a family in constant debt, her mother convinced her to enter a poetry competition where the first prize was $500. The poem she entered, under the name E. Vincent Millay, was called Renaissance.
All I could see from where I stood was 3 long mountains and a wood. I turned and looked the other way and saw 3 islands in a bay. So with my eyes I traced the line of the horizon, thin and fine, straight around till I was come back to where I'd started from. And all I saw from where I stood was 3 long mountains and a wood.
The lawyer and poet Arthur Fickey, who had read the poem, wrote to her with complimentary doubts about its authorship.
No sweet young thing of 20 ever ended a poem where this one ends. It takes a brawny male of 45 to do that.
Brawny male? I cling to my femininity. And gentlemen, when a woman insists that she is 20, you must not call her 45. That is more than wicked. It is indiscreet. P.S. The brawny male sends his picture.
She had counted on winning first prize, convinced her enticing letters and photographs would sway the judges. When they chose someone else, she was crushed.
She's just devastated because to them, that money would have meant all the difference in the world. It really would have been paying off debts. It would have meant curtains at the windows. You know, they used to stencil little apples and pears on the window. Well, nobody did that in Camden, Maine. So one of her high school girlfriends told me. Such friends one does not need.
The difference between first prize and no prize is, in fact, the difference between the distressing poverty of my family and a comparative ease. A release from the heartbreaking, soul-sickening desperation of old debt that I have lived with since I can remember. I have talked it, tasted it, breathed it. This, then, is what I have been waiting for from day to day, male to male, in such agony I had not known I could experience. This is the answer. This is the end. I wonder why I am not crying. My mother is crying. Did you ever hear your mother cry as if her heart would break? It is a strange and terrible sound. I think I shall never forget it.
It was the longest poem in the book. And all of the best-known poets of the day were included in this book. And they read her poem, and they said that it was outrageous that she had not won the prize. And one critic said that she was the poet who became famous by not winning the prize.
Even the man who won it was embarrassed that he'd won it and tipped his hat to her. Didn't give her the prize money, of course, but tipped his hat.
During the summer of 1912, the year Renaissance was published, Edna's younger sister, Norma, then 18, was working as a waitress at the local Whitehall Inn. It was a summer destination for well-to-do ladies from New York. At the end of the season, the staff put on a concert for the guests. The local Millay girls were part of the entertainment.
Several people in the audience who knew that she was a poet and that she had written this wonderful poem said, "Would you recite the poem?" And she turned on the piano stool and addressed the audience and recited all of this 200 and some line poem. And it was evidently a very thrilling moment.
And people were just stunned. Here's this little thing with this magnificent perception of life, death, God knows what, and the world.
There's a woman sitting in the audience who's the dean of the training school of the YWCA in New York. Her name is Caroline B. Dow, and she changes Millay's life.
And this lady, Caroline Dow, said, "Say, we're going to do something about this person. You know, she can't die on the vine in Camden." So she approached Mama, Cora, and said, "Well, you've got a genius. Something must be done about it." And Cora said, "Well, that's wonderful, but we haven't got a sou." And so Caroline Dow just stepped in and said she would see to it that they got the money. And she did. And at that point, it's very interesting in her diaries. Vincent said, "I guess I'm going to college, I guess I'm going." And then she says, "Well, I could go to Smith, I could go to the world was her oyster as far as which college to go to." But her decision was really great because when she got stuff from Vassar, she writes in her diary that, there are people in China, from, she didn't say Africa, I guess it wasn't, but France, Germany, and I could just see her think, that's where I'm going to go. And she did.
She arrived in New York in February 1913, a few days before her 21st birthday. To help pass the entrance exam to Vassar, Caroline Dow arranged for her to be tutored for 6 months in English, French, and Latin, and introduced her to Manhattan's literary society.
She was like a scamp, and she was provocative. Red curls, and quite, what did she say? She was photographed in New York by Arnold Genthe, who was then, I suppose, the way Annie Leibovitz is now, And he told her not only was she lovely looking, but she had the most beautiful throat he'd ever seen. And she wrote home and she said, I have a beautiful throat. Usually women are not admired for their throats, but at any rate, that had happened to her.
A lot of very important people in the literary world found her fascinating. She was extraordinary looking, she was very witty and charming, and she became the talk of the town here in New York before she ever went to Vassar. By the time she arrived at Vassar, she was a celebrity. It would be almost as if Bob Dillon had decided to go to college at the age of 22 or 23, when he was world famous. The result was very interesting. She turned the place upside down.
Oh, yeah. The big thing is, she was 21 when she entered Vassar. She was much older than the others. And she'd had a very liberal existence at home. They smoked cigarettes. They played gin rummy. Probably they had a little drink now and then, not much. And they danced and they flirted with boys. And Vassar was very, very strict. And that's where she ran into lots of trouble.
The most prestigious women's college in America was unlike anything Edna Millay had ever experienced. The ladies who sponsored her expected she would fit into a life that was orderly and refined. The students at Vassar were expected to study, to attend the proper social functions, and behave according to their status. It was not long before its restrictions began to chafe on its most famous student.
Every morning when I wake up, I swear I say, "Damn this pink and gray college. They treat us like an orphan asylum. They impose on us in 100 ways and then bring on ice cream, and I hate ice cream. They trust us with everything, but men. We can go to the candy kitchen and take what we like and pay or not, and nobody is there to know. But a man is forbidden as if he were an apple."
Well, she's 21. She's not a kid. She's not 17. And I remember interviewing rather elderly women when I began, who would say, well, she was just, people just drifted after her. I mean, she was like a poet, a published poet, It's hilarious. They had crushes on her. I mean, it was amazing.
Here's a girls' school. They're all young, adolescent. Gee whiz, there's no outlet. So there were love affairs between them. I can see that.
She had a megawatt sex drive. This was a hot-blooded young woman, and she found herself in the midst of a whole lot of adoring classmates, and she enjoyed the sex that was available to her.
By the end of her first year, she was spending a lot of time with a young Greek-American woman named Elaine Raleigh. She was rich, grew up in a fancy Manhattan apartment, and had traveled the world. And she fell in love with Edna St. Vincent Millay.
She's Elaine Raleigh, a junior, another hockey hero, cheerleader, rides horseback a lot, very boyish, and makes a lot of noise. Not tall, but all muscle. November 4th, 1914.
I think most people come to their sexual maturity sometime between 15 and 50. And so with Millay being older than the other girls, I think she was an extremely attractive figure. And I think Raleigh was very much in love with her. That's borne out by letters and poems and so forth.
She did have some very, very hot love affairs at Vassar. But they passed and nobody died of them. I mean...
While her eldest daughter was mixing with the cream of American womanhood, Cora, back in Camden, got a part-time job washing women's hair. When one of her clients turned out to be a student at Vassar, Cora couldn't contain herself and bragged about being Vincent's mother. When the girl came back to school and called on Millay, saying that Cora had suggested they become friends, Edna St. Vincent Millay's reaction was white-hot anger.
You must not think that just because a girl goes to Vassar, I want her to visit me. The girl is a non-entity at Vassar. I am not. You must never again invite anybody to see me unless it is somebody I want to see. People can say anything they like about me and my family conditions, but they cannot visit me unless I want them. And it doesn't make any difference whether you wash their heads or their floors. They have nothing on us unless we give it to them. As long as we consider ourselves their superior and can't get that out of our heads, they have nothing on us.
What Vincent says to her mother is, you can do their hair or they can whatever, but no way is a person like that going to enter into my life unless I wish to have her in my life. In other words, a social connection is not established, or an individual connection is not established simply because you do their hair or because we wait on them. I am a separate kettle of fish. And I think she made that wonderfully clear.
The First World War was raging in Europe, but had little real effect among the pink and grey buildings of Vassar. Edna took part in all the school plays, getting most of the female leads, particularly in the plays she wrote for herself. She was renowned as the school rebel. Her poems were being published in New York. She was idolized by the younger women and spoiled by most of the teaching staff. Edna St. Vincent Millay, 5 feet 1 inch tall, was the big girl on campus.
She didn't like the restrictions of Vassar. Also, she didn't like the ritual of having to be on time for classes. The headmaster, McCracken, liked her very much because he could see, here's this genius, this creative, beautiful poet. What the hell are we going to do with her, And she'd show up and she'd say, I've been in pain with the poem. I can't make it to class, Well, any other person would say, oh, come off it. And he understood, He let her get away with a lot. McCracken said he didn't want a dead Shelley on his doorstep, He indulged her. It was worth it.
But in her final year, shortly before she was supposed to graduate, Edna Millay finally did the unforgivable. Instead of being in her room, she spent the night in a local hotel.
It has become the story that she'd spent the night out with a young man in some inn on the reservoir on the other side of the Hudson, but it wasn't true. She simply had stayed overnight when she shouldn't have. She was grounded, or whatever it was called in Vassar in those days. She'd had too many privileges, and lots of the faculty, as well as some of the students, but not a majority, thank heaven, felt she'd gotten away with a little too much, Vincent Millay had,
Evidently, that was just the straw that broke the camel's back for the administration. This girl has just gotten away with murder, and we're not going to let her graduate with her friends.
So they kicked her out. And she'd written the hymn for the graduation ceremonies and for commencement, and she was not going to be allowed to graduate with her class. And so Cora wrote one of her really extraordinary letters. Cora was no mean literary person herself.
I am Vincent Millay's mother, and I am here to supplicant before you. The last I heard from Vincent directly was that she should graduate next Thursday. I have looked forward to this time as a culmination of a wonderful dream. But now this awful thing seems more than I can bear. If your decision is final, it's a blow from which I shall never recover. Must I give up my picture of my girl in her graduation exercises? You are taking the very bloom from the best thing that ever came into my life.
I don't think it was because of Cora's letter. I think by the time it got there, she'd already had the vote taken by her class that she was to be permitted, and the faculty, to graduate with her class. So she said, I came in over the wall and I'll be shipped out like a cold cod over the wall. But she wasn't. She graduated with her class.
Edna Millay graduated in 1917, moved back to New York. Her respectable middle-class sponsors, who'd paid her way through 4 years at Vassar, now organized a job for her as a secretary and social companion. They expected that Vincent would continue to write poems and perhaps recite them in the drawing rooms around New York. They had no idea what they had unleashed.
Was it for this I uttered prayers and sobbed and cursed and kicked the stairs, that now, domestic as a plate, I should retire at 8:30?
She quit the job within a few weeks, started promoting herself not only as a poet, but as an up-and-coming actress, and moved from respectable uptown Manhattan to the downtown artist neighborhood of Greenwich Village.
It was not just hip as we think of it now, but it was a place where, women wore short skirts, they could swear, they had their hair bobbed, they were working, they were sexually freer. I mean, it was just a place of, high romance value. Exciting. Bohemia.
Carolyn Dow was furious about this because she believed that if Millay was going to be a great poet, She couldn't be fooling around with the theater. That was no place for a serious writer. She made a little bit of money from her acting, but not very much. It was difficult. It was very hard for her for quite a while.
She was trying to get her poems published wherever she could, sending them to periodicals, to newspapers, and to Harriet Monroe's Poetry magazine, which had just started publishing in Chicago.
Poets are generally poor and starving, and so in the correspondence files of the magazine, there are quite a few letters about money, asking for a loan, asking for an advance on accepted poems. I'll just read. I'll read Edna's letter. This was from March 1918. She writes, "Dear Harriet Monroe, spring is here, and
I could be very happy, except that I am broke. Would you mind paying me now instead of upon publication for those so stunning verses of mine, which you have? I have become very, very thin and have taken to smoking Virginia tobacco. Wistfully yours, Edna St. Vincent Millay. P.S. I am awfully broke. Would you mind paying me a lot?"
At the newly formed Provincetown Playhouse, she won the female lead in a new play written and directed by 31-year-old Floyd Dell, who soon took more than a professional interest in his 25-year-old actress.
And I think Floyd Dell felt that she just had crushes on girls and they'd had crushes on her, and that she'd never really had a fully sexual relationship with a man. He was, in fact, quite right. And when she found out what he thought, she was, number one, appalled and furious. And then she gave it some thought, and she went to bed with him shortly after. Well, I think afterwards there was this sort of, they were both lying there, and he heard her say, now this is, it is footnoted, it is what he said, she said. And she said, apparently she'd enjoyed it, and she said that she would have many lovers, which he found a little disconcerting to hear.
"And if I loved you Wednesday, well, what is that to you? I do not love you Thursday, so much is true. And why you come complaining is more than I can see. I loved you Wednesday, yes, but what is that to me?"
She was ruthless. She was ruthless. She used men for her own ends, whether it was for her own pleasure, sexual pleasure, or whether it was for the experience. That's the thing. She was so passionate. The big thing was passion and poetry. If an affair or a sexual encounter could be used, to nurture her poetry, that was fine. Whether she hurt somebody, she might fret about it a little bit, but she was quite ruthless in that way.
The line between the poetry that she was writing and the life that she was living became blurred, and the poems were not only based on the life that she was living, they became almost a prescription for the way that she was living.
These were the years right after the war. A whole set of old beliefs had been shattered by the horrors of the First World War. The young jazz babies were coming along, eager to have their own experience mirrored in what they were reading, an experience that didn't depend on the old pieties, on the old emotional or erotic expectations, or lack thereof. Millay comes along, her emotions, although set in beautifully crafted sonnets, the emotions are raw and eager, urgent, and especially, no one had ever heard a woman write this way.
"I shall forget you presently, my dear. So make the most of this, your little day, your little month, your little half a year, ere I forget or die or move away. I would indeed that love were longer lived and oaths were not so brittle as they are, but it is so, and nature has contrived to struggle on without a break thus far, whether or not we find what we are seeking is idle, biologically speaking."
Her younger sister Norma had arrived in New York, and early in 1918 their youngest sister Kathleen also joined them. The three lived together in the top-floor apartment at 25 Charlton Street. It wasn't long before the Millay girls were part of the artists' community, regulars in the taverns and speakeasies of Greenwich Village. Kathleen started publishing her own poems, and Norma was getting more acting jobs with Eugene O'Neill. She would become one of O'Neill's favorite actresses, while Edna continued to write poetry in a style that America had never seen before.
She really reversed the roles in poetry. They called her the it girl, and I don't disagree with that, but I think there was more than that. There was a depth to her poetry as well, and she had real skill. It wasn't a tease.
Oh, you will be sorry for that word. Give back my book and take my kiss instead. Was it my enemy or my friend I heard? What a big book for such a little head. Come, I will show you now my newest hat, and you may watch me purse my mouth and prink. Oh, I shall love you still and all of that. I shall never again tell you what I think. I shall be sweet and crafty, soft and sly. You will not catch me reading any more. I shall be called a wife to pattern by, and some day when you knock and push the door, some sane day, not too bright and not too stormy, I shall be gone, and you may whistle for me.
One sane day, not too bright and not too stormy, I shall be gone, and you may whistle for me. Now, no one was writing those things, and also, again, she was doing this with wonderful form.
She was writing steadily, developing a reputation as a poet who used the sonnet as a weapon in the battle of the sexes, and as an independent woman who broke men's hearts on a whim.
I think one of the amazing things about her relationships with all these men is that they remained so devoted to her afterwards. She kept in touch with so many of them, and not just in touch, they were devoted friends afterwards. There was some way that she could lay waste to a person and yet have them be faithful in some ways afterwards. Clearly, people loved her, really fell for her in deep ways.
Among the men who'd be laying waste was a young writer named Edmund Wilson, known to his friends as Bunny. Wilson had been at Princeton with Scott Fitzgerald. He'd become his editor. He'd been in France during the First World War, but when he came to the village in 1919 to work as an editor at Vanity Fair, he was still a virgin. Edna St. Vincent Millay took care of that little problem, and Edmund Wilson thought he had found a soulmate.
She ignited both my intellectual passion and my unsatisfied desire, which went up together in a blaze of ecstasy that remains for me one of the high points of my life. I do not believe that such experiences are common, for such women are not common.
Wilson was very, very deeply in love with her, and it was the first woman he'd ever made love with, so he said. And Millay said something to him like, I know it was just wonderful, and then it's over. And he was like, he wanted to marry her. I mean, he wanted a life with her. And she did not think that would be such a good idea.
I know how you feel. It was here, it was beautiful, and now it's gone. Poor Bunny. It will never be right between us, will it, my dear? I have wronged you greatly. I know that. However, I shall try to do better in the future.
Wilson's friend and fellow Vanity Fair editor John Peel Bishop also fell in love with Edna Millay. She called them the choir boys from hell.
They met her at a party, and they both simultaneously fell in love with her, and she thought that was fine. And for a while, she dated both of them, and one drunken night, the three of them ended up in bed together.
No, people have, I think, rather misunderstood that. I hope I'm not so naive. I mean, no, they talk about having each one trying to decide who has the better half. And one is holding the top part of her, and one is holding the bottom part of her. I don't think they're both making love to her. at the same time. I don't. I think it's kind of a joke. I mean, they're having dinner. They're drinking perhaps a little too much. They're having a little playful fun. They're in their 20s.
I think she played them against one another. I mean, she was very fond of them. She was not in love with them. You know, she treated Bunny terribly, and she must have treated Bishop the same way.
I do not know what will become of me. I know I am in a dreadful condition. I do not think there is a woman in whom the roots of passion shoot deeper than in me.
It was to Bishop that she arrived one day at lunch to make love to him and explained that she was in a hurry because she just made love to someone else and after him was on her way to her third tryst of the day. When someone counted up the current lovers and told Bunny Wilson that Edna had made love to at least 18 men in a month, Wilson suggested they form an alumni association.
Edmund Wilson very quickly realized that this was a woman that he could not possibly marry, although he proposed marriage to her. She turned him down, and he was later very happy he was glad that he hadn't married her because he thought that it would have been a disaster.
Between 1919 and 1920, Vincent had published over 50 individual poems in various magazines. She'd also published 2 books of collected verse, had written a play, was publishing humorous articles for Vanity Fair under her pen name, Nancy Boyd.
She was really becoming a celebrity, not just a cult figure, but a celebrity.
I am becoming famous. Vanity Fair has a whole page of my poems and a photograph of me that looks about as much like me as it does like Arnold Bennett. And there have been 3 reviews of something I wrote in New York newspapers in the last week alone. I just got a prize of $100 in poetry for the Beanstalk, and I'm spending it all on clothes. I've the sweetest new evening gown you ever saw, and shoes with straps across them, and stockings with embroidery up the front.
She was now being paid to read her poems in public, invited to towns all over America, where young women and men lined up to see this new literary sensation from the wild side of New York City.
There must have been something in her manner, a kind of vulnerability combined with a kind of glamour. She was small and fragile. I know reports of her readings are quite spectacular when she would, at huge auditoriums, and she would make an entrance in a red velvet gown and her flame red hair, tiny little figure, and out came this very large, wonderfully modulated voice.
By her 4th year in Greenwich Village, she'd established herself as a poetic force of nature. But there had been many men and many poems, and her latest affair, with a married man, had ended in disaster. Now she wanted to escape.
Yeah, I think she was besieged by people. I think she was trying to write. I think there was never enough money. And I think an affair had broken up rather badly, and with the threat of suicide by the wife of the man. It's very complicated at that time. And when Frank Crowninshield is the man who runs Vanity Fair, gives her the chance to go abroad and be a foreign correspondent, she leaps at it and tells her mother that she's always wanted to do this, and she's about to go.
I am going as a free woman, a businesswoman, and because I want to travel. I shall be perfectly happy and perfectly safe because I speak French and because I am a very capable and sensible woman, when left to myself.
Paris was a remarkable city in 1920. The war, which had brought death to 20 million people, had been over for only 2 years. Paris was now celebrating the living. Edna St. Vincent Millay, the bilingual, bisexual poet of Greenwich Village, fitted right in.
I finally found a woman who had been in love with Edna Millay in Paris at that time. And in fact, according to her, they had been lovers. And then she was cast aside when this young Frenchman, who she said wasn't worth a penny, a franc or whatever, came into Millay's life. Cora Millay was already living in Paris because Edna had brought her over. And yet, Millay didn't shield her mother from the nature of this relationship, which was sexual.
Cora had arrived in 1922 to find her 30-year-old daughter in the midst of yet another affair and complaining of ill health. Cora, the practical nurse, recognized the symptoms. Edna St. Vincent Millay was pregnant. Cora took her across the Channel to England, and they settled in a small cottage in the hamlet of Shillingstone in Dorset. And here, they prepared for an abortion. From an ancient book of herbal remedies, Cora found a recipe based on a plant called alkanet, and she brewed a concoction of it for her daughter to drink.
I couldn't believe the things that she was ingesting. I mean, no wonder she had stomach trouble. I mean, thistles and pennyroyal and alkanet and everything you can think of.
I think Cora felt that she was saving Vincent by aborting the child. Now, none of the sisters had any children. This was not the first abortion. I don't know, she might have had scads. I don't think there were scads, but, she was so promiscuous. I can imagine that she had many. Obviously, she did not want children.
In January of 1923, Cora and her daughter sailed back to New York. America's favorite woman poet was home, though now plagued with stomach problems. Her sister Norma suggested she buy a new breakfast cereal and asked if she'd tried it.
No, I've never tried Kellogg's bran, but if Mr. Kellogg has invented something that will move my bowels, I will marry him.
She'd been out of the country for 2 years. She was 31. Her younger sisters had now both married, but when she moved back to Greenwich Village, there was no man in Vincent's life. That was about to change.
She was invited by friends to a weekend house in Croton on the Hudson, and she took a slight interest in this Boissevain fellow whom she had met once or twice in New York, was a guest at the party.
Eugene Boissevain had been married to the famous American suffragette Inez Milholland. Edna had heard her speak at Vassar. But Milholland had died of a rare blood disorder in 1917, and Boissevain had not remarried.
He had sort of rugged good looks, very well educated, self-educated, spoke French, Dutch, German, English, and really was, in the early part of his life, he was quite an adventurer. He traveled all over the world. He did big game hunting in Africa.
Eugene shared a house in Croton with socialist writer and publisher Max Eastman, where they spent most weekends with lots of booze, lots of women, and lots of party games.
They decided, after a couple of cocktails, I'm sure, and to pass the time, they would take a play that was then very popular on Broadway and reverse the plot of it. The plot, I think, was about two country people who come to the city and are done in by all the wiles and ways of city people. So they decided to reverse the plot, assign roles, and improvise.
That must have been something. Because, they played games in those days.
And by complete chance, she and Boissevain were assigned the roles of the lovers and the hero and heroine here, who in this case are city folks who come to the country and are debased and ruined by all of the local yokels.
They said it was just amazing to see these two people acting out the charade and falling in love truly in front of everybody. Yeah.
By the end of Act 3, something had happened between the two of them, and a month later they were married.
I'm very fond of Eugene. I like the whole sound of him. I think he was a great strapping Dutch merchant, and he came in and swept Millay off her feet to take care of her.
He was not a writer. He imported coffee, but he loved the arts, and he realized and recognized a genius when he saw it. He knew that she was having a terrible time keeping alive, and he wanted to nurture her, be the steward, whatever. And he did, on her terms.
Arthur Fickey, who'd become one of her more serious New York lovers, was also a friend of Boissevin.
He was out of his head. Finally, I said to him that Miss Millay was nobody's fool and that he was one of the most attractive men alive. Why didn't he just take the Millay by the horns and invite her to come out and spend a week at his country place? Hell, Arthur, he said. I don't want to have a dirty little love affair with her. I want to marry her.
And marry her he did, on July 18th, 1923, in the garden of the house in Croton. Her sister Norma prepared a veil from mosquito netting, and two former lovers, Arthur Fickey and Floyd Dell, were among the small group of witnesses. They agreed that theirs would be an open marriage, promising they would not stand in each other's way if a new passion should come along, yet they would remain committed to each other. Immediately after the ceremony, they drove into New York, and Edna was admitted to hospital for an operation on her stomach. She told her new husband that if she died on her wedding day, she'd be immortalized.
The thing to remember is that Millay, I'm almost certain, had Crohn's disease, which is an inflammation of the colon, which by that time had begun to cause adhesions in her colon. And during the time that she was in Europe, the entire time that she was in Europe, she was anemic. She was her digestive system was totally shot, and she was very, very sick by the time she got back, and she didn't really know what was wrong with her.
Her recovery took place on the porch at Croton, where Eugen took lots of photographs, and Edna posed. In November of 1923, with her health improving, they moved into Greenwich Village for the winter and rented the narrowest house in New York at 75.5 Bedford Street. Eugen sold his coffee importing business, telling her he was now devoting all his time and money to looking after her. He started planning a belated honeymoon trip around the world for his new bride, who was fast becoming more and more famous. Her new collection, The Harp-Weaver and Other Poems, was a huge hit. She became the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for poetry. There were now speaking tours, which brought in big fees, and she finally paid off all her debts and her mother's debts. Everyone wanted to see the bohemian from Greenwich Village, who had now grown up.
She would appear in velvet gowns and capes and sort of make these grand entrances into the hallway and keep people riveted the entire time. She was very, very good at what she did and very good at projecting that persona, which was, no doubt, no small part of her appeal.
Darling Eugen, I got through my 2 readings yesterday well enough. The one in the afternoon was a great success. A crowded house, large audience. But the one in the evening was in a private house in the next town, and God, how I hate reading in a private house. If ever I felt like a prostitute, it was last night. I kept saying over and over to myself while I was reading to them, never mind, it's $150.
At the height of her fame, she was making the equivalent of $300,000 a year, contemporary equivalent of $300,000 a year from her poetry. And they had other income coming in from other sources. So they did quite well.
In March of 1925, America's most famous woman poet and her husband left Greenwich Village and settled in to restore an old farmhouse in the hamlet of Austerlitz in upstate New York. It cost them $9,000.
They bought 300 acres to begin with, and then they added to that afterwards. $9,000. Huh. Oh, well, good for them.
She named the farm Steepletop after a local wildflower. And here, Eugen Boissevin and Edna Millay would live for the rest of their lives.
They farm at Steepletop. He does most of the farming. And she finds it a retreat, and she finds the solitude a balm. I mean, she finds it soothing. And she says, and I think they do go into the city whenever they feel like it. They've got a car. They stay at the St. Regis. So it seems like a solution.
So they built a barn and sunken gardens and a pool, and then they made a badminton court. And she did beautiful rose garden and rock garden.
Edna St. Vincent Millay, the bohemian poet who'd scandalized America, was settling into the upper middle class at Steepletop, but there was no pretense at suddenly becoming a domestic goddess.
I have nothing to do with my household. Eugen does all that kind of thing. He engages the servants, he shows them around. I don't interfere with his ordering of the house. If there is anything I don't like, I tell him. I have no time for it. I want to go into my dining room as if it were a restaurant and say, "What a charming dinner."
I mean, she could be a bit of a witch with the servants. Nobody could cook exactly the way she wanted. They also always burned the linen, or charged too much, or were slobs, or whatever.
The only people I really hate are servants. They are not really human beings at all. They have no conscience, no heart, no sense of responsibility, no memory of kind treatment or past favors. Even their sins are not human sins, but the sins of magpies, of monkeys, serpents, and pigs.
She was not very nice. She was this little girl from Maine who made it, and she treated some of the servants like dirt. And some of them, it's awful. I just thought, oh, come on. You're just too much. Remember, you came from Camden on the wrong side of the tracks, for heaven's sake. But she was dreadful to them.
The American composer Deems Taylor had been asked to write the first American opera to be commissioned by the Metropolitan Opera Company. He visited Steepletop to convince Edna to write the libretto. It took them 2 years, but in February of 1927, The King's Henchman finally debuted. The next day, composer and librettist posed for the film cameras.
It was a hit. It received 20 curtain calls on the first night at the Metropolitan Opera. It went on a 40-city tour around the country. It was reviewed in the New Yorker as it's the first time I think any review of a new opera has said that praised the librettist before the composer.
Back in Austerlitz, Arthur Ficky and his new wife had bought a farmhouse near Steepletop. For several years, he and Gladys were constant companions of Edna and Eugen. The couples were close.
They had some wild parties, from what I've heard of. I mean, there was a lot of heavy drinking in the 1920s and the 1930s, particularly during Prohibition, and lots of rumors of orgy sort of activities based on very slender documentation.
Oh, yeah, they all had fun together. They probably all switched partners. I'm sure they did. They ran around in the nude. Apparently, he took a lot of nude pictures down at the pool, and Norma burned them up. And Norma burned up all the dildos, too. She had some trouble getting some of them to burn.
Who knows what might have gone on in the middle of the night after many, many martinis, and we won't ever know.
She was planning another cross-country tour to promote a new book of poems entitled The Buck and the Snow.
The Buck and the Snow is the first book of poetry that Millay has written, which doesn't have any love poems in it. She was married, she was happy, her life was stable, Love poetry requires a certain amount of turmoil. And I believe that she was beginning to feel a certain stagnation at Steepletop. As much as she loved it and as happy as she was there, it lacked the excitement that had stimulated the great early sonnets.
If Edna was looking for turmoil, she wasn't long in finding it. Her 1928 tour for The Buck in the Snow took her to Chicago, where she would read at the university, here in Mandel Hall. It was packed, and she delivered her new poems and some of her now famous standards.
What lips my lips have kissed, and where and why I have forgotten, and what arms have lain under my head till morning. But the rain is full of ghosts tonight that tap and sigh upon the glass and listen for reply, and in my heart there stirs a quiet pain for unremembered lads that not again will turn to me at midnight with a cry. Thus in the winter stands the lonely tree, nor knows what birds have vanished one by one, yet knows its boughs more silent than before. I cannot say what loves have come and gone. I only know that summer sang in me a little while, that in me sings no more.
I think more and more people see some of the really remarkable poems. They're remarkable because they tell the heart's truth, and they do it in a way that's so memorable and so brilliantly done. Not every poem is great, but the ones that are like nothing else.
Following her reading, Eugen was waiting in the dressing room with a flask of whiskey. Among the fans who gathered there was the young Chicago poet George Dillon, who'd introduced her that night to the audience.
He was a very good-looking young man, and black curly hair and a long upper lip, and so forth. And he wrote poetry.
Dillon had just published his first collection of poems to rave reviews. He had a job at an advertising agency, writing ads for razor blades, and lived with his parents in an expensive Chicago apartment overlooking the lake.
Well, I think at that point in her life, she was in her 30s, and she had lived a pretty much protected life up at Steepletop. She met this handsome, interesting poet, and I think the time was right.
And it is true that later that afternoon she writes him a note in which she suggests that they're fated to be with each other. And indeed they are. It's an astonishing story.
Edna and Eugen had a week to spend in Chicago before they left for Syracuse and her next performance. That week, the threesome toured the city. Dillon showed off the skyscrapers, and they had dinner with his parents. And sometime during the visit, America's most famous woman poet, aged 36, seduced a 21-year-old novice writer, and did so with her husband's blessing.
I don't know if it was blessing. He said that, I would say he probably said, well, it's our agreement. Okay. I mean, you know, he stuck by that. I think he must have gone through hell.
But I don't think he wanted to stop Millay. I think he was so supportive of her. He wanted her to be happy. And let's face it, what was the alternative? Had he said no, he could risk losing her.
She behaved badly. I mean, there's no question about that. She was drinking too much. She perhaps gotten a little heavier, which seems to happen with age. And she loved Dillon. She knew Eugen was not, he was jealous to a certain degree, but he was much more supportive of the relationship than she had any reason to believe that he should have been.
Boissevain was not only a handsome, vital man, but as an older man, made up for the father that she had missed all her life. And he took extraordinary care of her. To throw all that over for a young man whom you meet on a tour and who is clearly homosexual, I don't know what their erotic life could have been. She leaves home and runs off with a man who Who knows?
Whether he was homosexual or not, it's very hard for me to know. I mean, seriously. And would she have fallen in love with someone who was homosexual? I mean, she was an extremely famous woman, very powerful, very well known. There were lots of people around her all the time. Who would she choose to love? Is it not more important, maybe, that he was a poet and Eugen was not? Is there not some element, maybe, where you get a little tired of being taken care of so carefully, so closely?
When they got back to Steepletop, Edna insisted that Eugen convince her lover to come to the farm. It was Eugen who finally wrote to him in Chicago.
Vincent is writing to you, asking you to come to Steepletop. I, too, want you to come. I am going to make you love me, and you must make me love you. So put on a gay tie and pack your evening clothes and a clean shirt. Come, we'll drink wine and laugh together. Affectionately, Eugen.
In January of 1929, George Dillon boarded the train from Chicago and made his way to Steepletop. They drank a lot of wine, but there's some doubt about whether Eugen Boissevin was laughing.
I felt he seemed a saint, I must say. He was kicked out of her bedroom, moved to the rear of the house. Maybe by that time he was used to her peculiarities, as he had always sensed her needs. Maybe he realized that this was a time just for him to step aside. I couldn't have done it, but he did.
After a week, George went back to his job and his family in Chicago. Edna wrote to him constantly.
We have two precious things we share. We love each other and have told the truth about it. I tell you now that I shall love you always and that I shall never let you out of my life. The situation is a strange one, truly. I am devoted to my husband. I love him more deeply than I could ever express. My feeling for him is in no way changed or diminished since I met you. But whenever I think of you, and I think of you all day and half the night, an enchanted sickness comes over me, as if I had drunk a witch's philtre. Surely I shall see you again, and kiss you again. What sweet agony it is to remember kissing you, to imagine the sound of your voice. I love you.
The relationship with George Dillon became her obsession. She hounded him, pursued him, peppered him with letters and notes. When he didn't write back immediately, she'd go on a drinking binge and then return to Steepletop, assuming she had lost him.
We've been so dazed with liquor. I'm not sober yet, and I don't intend to be. Tried my best to drink myself right out of the picture, lapping from one speakeasy to another and hardly knowing who was holding my hand. It was pretty hideous, thinking I had lost you just when I needed so seriously everything in my life that was beautiful to remind me that life could be born at all. Very likely I have lost you, but don't let it go into effect just yet. Wait until I have become accustomed to this pain, which grows worse every day.
Her long-distance affair with Dillon continued, and he returned to Steepletop for short visits in 1929 and 1930. While he was there, Eugen was simply moved to a back bedroom. In the winter of 1931, her mother became seriously ill. They drove through a blizzard to Maine, but by the time they got to Camden, Cora Millay was dead. She was 67 years old, and Edna wanted her buried at Steepletop.
The ground was so frozen at Steepletop that they had to dynamite for 4 days in order to open up a grave in the ground big enough for Cora. And then they, late at night, in the middle of the night, in the middle of the snow, they took their lanterns and they went up the hill to bury Cora, and they They cracked a bottle of Lancer's champagne over the coffin and then shot their rifles over the grave.
Cora Millay had not lived to see her daughter's most famous collection of poems, published just 2 months after her death. The collection of 52 remarkable sonnets chronicling Edna's affair with George Dillon. It was called Fatal Interview.
A huge hit. Astonishing to think that a book published in the heart of the Depression would, within a couple of months of appearing, have sold 50,000 copies in a time when people didn't have money.
She linked her life and her art so inextricably and so immediately. The one fed the other. And I think that's what a lot of people were crazy about, is they could look at each poem as a sort of lens to see the life.
The old roles are reversed. You have the woman pursuing, the older woman pursuing the younger man, and being consumed by this desire and burned and nearly destroyed by it.
Love is not all. It is not meat, nor drink, nor slumber, nor a roof against the rain, nor yet a floating spar to men that sink and rise and sink and rise and sink again. Love cannot fill the thickened lung with breath, nor clean the blood, not set the fractured bone. Yet many a man is making friends with death, even as I speak, for lack of love alone. It may well be that in a difficult hour, pinned down by pain and moaning for release, or nagged by want past resolution's power, I might be driven to sell your love for peace, or trade the memory of this night for food. It may well be. I do not think I would.
Why is it that 14 lines, which a sonnet must be, is enough for love? We're taught that it's usually divided in two. The first 8 lines ask a question, the second 6 lines give an answer, pose a problem, and suggest a solution. Why is the question always longer than the answer in love, in the sonnet? Why is the problem given more space than the solution? Perhaps that reflects the nature of love as well, but the sonnet is very good because of its long tradition. If you write a sonnet, you almost invariably are buoyed up by the form. The material that you put into it is transformed by the whole history and tradition of a sonnet. And Millay knew that early on and wrote brilliantly.
In the summer of 1932, Eugene took Edna to Paris. But within weeks, George Dillon arrived to be with her. Eugene returned to New York, alone.
And he finally said, I'm going home. I'm going back to Steepletop. I'm going to leave you here with George. Stay with him as long as you want. Bring him back if you like. He said, but try to make up your mind whether you want to be with me or be with him.
Oh, God, he wrote her endless letters. Oh, he adored her. And he wanted them to be together. He wanted her to have the chance, if she loved someone else, she should make love with that person. It was as if it was a medicine, like a restorative, as perhaps it was. But, people are not to be used quite like that. It doesn't work quite that way, it seems to me.
Edna remained in Paris with her young lover, and Eugene pottered around the farmhouse by himself. But soon, from here, the letters he wrote became more and more desperate. Heartbreaking letters to France, asking his wife to come home.
How long, Edna? How long must I wait? I am but half alive away from you. Never have I longed for anyone as I am longing for you. I want you. I want to see you. And smell you. And hear you.
And he just about died when she was in France. Oh, those letters, have you read those? Oh, they're just so...
The affair had stretched into its 4th year. Edna was now 40. George Dillon was 24.
I believe that his passion for her, his physical passion, was real. But I think that ebbed as he got older and discovered more about his own sexuality and what he wanted. I believe that he loved her, but I don't think that he loved her after the first few years. I don't believe that he was that attracted to her physically.
I think the poor guy was exhausted by her attentions and tried to get away from her. I think but she used him in a way. It's hard to say why exactly and why him. There must have been a certain, maybe it was a kind of weakness in him, a kind of vulnerability in him, so she could play the strong one in this relationship, as she had played the weak one in her relationship with her husband. Who knows? Who knows what happened in those hotel rooms in Paris?
By the end of the summer of 1932, Edna Millay appeared to accept that her affair was over. Dillon stayed in France, and she moved back to Steepletop and Eugen.
Well, I don't think Millay planned to go off with George Dillon forever. She knew she had a safe, secure place to go back to. But, that's the stuff of poetry.
Over the next 3 or 4 years, she would continue to see George Dillon intermittently, but the high passion of the affair was over. Dillon would also win the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry and become editor of Poetry magazine. He later rejected 8 of Edna's poems, but did publish one telling verse.
And you laugh, and you are you, none other. Your laughter pelts my skin with soft, delicious blows. And I wish I did not feel like your mother.
Back at Steepletop, life resumed for Edna and Eugen, with a difference. Since the mid-1930s, she'd been using morphine to counter a pain in a sore shoulder. But now the morphine and alcohol use was increasing. They would start drinking before noon, and then well into the evenings. And more, morphine became her opiate of choice.
She would take a shot of morphine to prepare for people coming, so that she was on a high. I really think she was a manic depressive. That's my feeling. She was either, and she even says this, I am not a happy person. I am either in ecstasy or in, the dumps.
I believe that she began taking morphine for her hangovers. What's better for a hangover than morphine? By the late 1930s, she was addicted, tragically addicted to morphine.
Hidden among the vast amount of papers she left, the Millay biographers discovered a series of notebooks which appeared to be meticulous accounts of the amount of drugs she was taking.
And I eventually called them the drug notebooks, because what they were was a record of how much morphine, whether she was taking a gram or a half a gram or an 1/18 of a gram, or how much she was taking during the day. And there were shots of other things as well.
When you see those drug notebooks, how this little person, she was tiny, and she drank on top of that, and she took other medications on top of it, and she took it not occasionally, it was like sometimes every half hour. It's unbelievable that she was alive.
I took these notebooks to an eminent doctor in New York, and this doctor, who was a woman, looked at these notebooks and she said, my God, she was taking 4 times the amount that a person on the street would be taking now. And she was 5'1", maybe 120 pounds. So she was a very deep addict.
I am at present under the influence of hashish, gin, bad poetry, love, morphine, and hunger. Seldom has the morphine seemed so slow in getting to me, although poor Eugen, who naturally hates like hell to have to give it to me, is quicker with it than the doctor by now.
At first, Eugen simply got her the drugs, until he recognized the strength of her addiction.
Well, he was very upset about it, but then, he started taking it so that he would experience everything she experienced. Phew.
He decided to take it with her. He took the morphine with her, and then he withdrew. And he stopped, and then he took less and less. And he said, now you just do what I do. And he was able to get off the morphine, and she wasn't.
She'd be hospitalized several times to wean her from the drug. It didn't work. But if Edna St. Vincent Millay was a serious morphine addict in 1939, it did not keep her from predicting world events.
I am horrified by what I hear is happening in Germany. The men in power in Germany are not human beings in the sense that we have been brought to understand that term. We have beasts in control of human beings. I am not speaking of the German people themselves, but if we have a wild animal to deal with, we cannot be pacifists forever.
When the war did come, she produced from her writing hut in the woods a book of poems to be used as war propaganda. It was entitled Make Bright the Arrows, and she knew its limitations.
She wrote to a friend and said, Charlotte Babcock Sills, and she wrote and she said, you have your sons to give to the war. All I have is my reputation as a poet. I'm putting it on the line. And so she knew there was a problem with that. And if you look at those poems, it's very sad to read those poems because you'll see that there's some hysteria. She has a shrill voice in some cases. She just wants to, she's just all over the place.
There's not the consistency that there was in the early books, but because she was a real poet, even with diminished powers, she can write a poem that will make the hair on the back of your neck stand up.
So Millay suffered greatly, and then when the critics really panned her, she suffered more from that. And she said, she was very depressed. She had a terrible time in the 40s. She was in and out of the hospital a few times. And after that, she wrote for the Writers' War Board. She did a few other pieces of writing, but that was really the end of her career. It would have been better professionally had she not written that book, had she stopped writing at the end of the 30s, at the top of her game. But, who could determine that?
The universal taste in poetry was changing. The modern poets, Eliot, Pound, Auden, were now taking center stage. Edna St. Vincent Millay was suddenly old-fashioned.
Students were brought up to read The Wasteland or more difficult poetry and thought that this Millay's was sentimental and reactionary. And it's taken a long time for readers to see through fashion. Fashions change, literary fashions change. The same thing happened with a poet like Longfellow, who was the most beloved and popular poet in the English-speaking world, and nowadays is barely remembered.
The academics and critics may have turned on her, but to the American public of the day, she was still an icon. Her portrait was painted for the cover of Macall's, calling her America's foremost woman poet. On Sunday nights, the country could listen to her read her work on the radio, but the pizzazz was gone. By the time the war ended, she'd become almost reclusive at Steepletop. She had the phone taken out, refused to see guests, continued to fight her addiction. Her sister Kathleen had died an alcoholic. Eugen was also fighting a new battle with lung cancer.
Yeah. I think he kept it from himself, I think. But, they smoked and smoked and smoked and drank and drank and drank. He made fairly light of it, but, Eugene was Eugene. He was going to have one lung removed and said, well, got the other lung. I'll be back, honey, And it never happened. Embolism.
It was devastating. I think they had grown very closely together. And she had recovered from her morphine addiction, and she recovered from it a good deal with his help. And then to suddenly lose him, to suddenly not have Eugen there, was unbelievable.
There will be rose and rhododendron when you are dead and underground. Still will be heard from white syringas heavy with bees a sunny sound. Spring will not ail, nor autumn falter. Nothing will know that you are gone, saving alone some sullen ploughland none but yourself sets foot upon. Oh, there will pass with your great passing little of beauty not your own. Only the light from common water, only the grace from simple stone.
That winter, she was taken to Doctors' Hospital in New York, where she was diagnosed as neurotic, undernourished, and with cirrhosis of the liver. She insisted on drinking 1.5 bottles of wine every day, and the hospital agreed to let her have it. A week or so later, she was back at Steepletop.
Oh, I think her last years are a very sad, pathetic spectacle. She was addicted to morphine, addicted to alcohol. People around her whom she loved were dying, and I think poetry left her. You know, she had tied it so immediately to her life that it wasn't there for her. I think it's hard to find anything very uplifting in her last years.
This is a woman who had been famous from the time that she was 19 years old, and considered by the time that she won the Pulitzer Prize in 1923, she was widely considered the greatest poet in America.
She got a sympathy note from George Dillon, saying that she could always count on him. She wrote back and asked him to come to Steepletop. He didn't. As the year progressed, she may have finally stopped taking morphine. A local couple were hired to help occasionally in the house, and she started working on the job of living alone. In her ever-present diary, she wrote it was time she finally started to look after herself and stop being a baby. Earlier, she'd written a hand-scrawled will, leaving everything to her sister Norma. She stayed at the house through the spring and summer of 1950 and prepared for a lonely winter.
She redecorated the house. She tried to keep herself busy. She didn't entertain much. She didn't see anybody. Even her sister was refused admittance, or she didn't see anybody much. I think that during the last months of her life, she began to drink again.
On October 17, 1950, she'd been working late. When she finally prepared for bed, it was well after midnight.
She'd probably been drinking and drinking and drinking. I don't mean just that night, but, you know, she was absolutely bereft after Eugene. He was everything to her. He really was. So
she went up to her room, smoked, must have smoked, may have taken something beside to help her sleep beside the wine, which she'd been drinking and left on the staircase.
But somehow or other she lost her balance and came crashing down the stairs and broke her neck. And John Pinney found her at the bottom in the next day.
John Pinney, the hired man who found her the next morning, said that she was reeking of alcohol.
She was 58 years old. She'd been working on a poem, a eulogy for her husband, and had circled a few lines.
I will control myself or go inside. I will not flaw perfection with my grief. Handsome this day, no matter who has died.
More than 50 years after her death, a few dedicated fans gather at Steepletop for the occasional summer afternoon fundraiser to help preserve the house and the faded gardens and to remember the life and the work.
I should not cry aloud. I could not cry aloud or wring my hands in such a place. I should but watch the station lights go by with a more careful interest on my face, or raise my eyes and read with greater care where to store furs and how to treat the hair.
By 1923, Edna St. Vincent Millay's candle was sputtering. She was famous, glamorous, and exhausted. That same year, she had become the first woman...
After Edna died, her sister Norma did move into the house and refused to have anything of Edna's moved or changed. When Norma died in the mid-1980s, she willed the house to the Millay Literary Society, run by Liz Barnett.
Literary executor Elizabeth Barnett, who saved Steepletop.
And she too decided to keep the house the way it was. The gatherings take place in the field where she used to have her tennis court, and every so often the curious will make the trek deep in the Steepletop woods, about a mile from the farmhouse, to where Edna St. Vincent Millay's ashes were interred next to her mother and her husband. She had outlived Eugène Boissevin by just over a year.
When this book is mold and a book of many waiting to be sold for a casual penny in a little open case, in a street unclean and cluttered where a heavy mud is splattered from the passing drays, stranger, pause and look. From the dust of ages, lift this little book. Turn the tattered pages, read me, do not let me die. Search the fading letters, finding steadfast in the broken binding all that once was I. Suns that shine by night, mountains made from valleys, bear me to the light, flat upon your bellies by the webby window lie, where the little flies are crawling. Read me, margin me with scrawling, do not let me die.